Three princesses chose their daily chores over the command of a god. This is the ancient myth of the Minyades, a story of divine fury, terrifying transformation, and a battle between the orderly world of the loom and the wild call of ecstasy. By the end, you will understand the shocking psychological truth behind this 2,000-year-old warning. We will meet the disciplined princesses, witness the arrival of the disruptive god Dionysus, and unravel the sequence of ominous warnings, devastating madness, and a final, eerie metamorphosis that still echoes today. What does it truly mean to deny a fundamental part of life itself? Nestled in the fertile plains of Boeotia, the ancient city of Orchomenos was a place of sober prosperity. Its people, the Minyades, were not just wealthy, they were famously disciplined. Their wealth was not a gift from the gods of revelry, but the product of relentless industry. The rhythm of life here was measured by the steady, methodical clack of the loom, not the wild beat of the tambourine. For the women of this city, especially its princesses, virtue was demonstrated through skilled, diligent work. Managing the household, weaving fine textiles, these were not mere chores, but sacred duties that upheld the entire social order. Their world was one of clean lines, predictable patterns, and tangible results. You could see your virtue in the length of thread spun, measure your worth in the bolts of cloth produced. This created a culture deeply suspicious of anything that threatened that productive order, anything that valued ecstatic feeling over tangible creation. It was into this world of tightly wound threads, both literal and social, that a new and utterly foreign sound began to drift from the mountains. The cult of Dionysus was coming, and it promised to unravel everything the Minyades held dear. Within the palace walls, three sisters embodied this ideal completely. Their names were Orchomenos, Arcip, and Alcathoe, daughters of the stern King Minyas. They were not wicked or cruel, but profoundly, unshakably dedicated. Their world was the women's quarters, their kingdom the loom. To them, the highest form of piety was not singing hymns on a mountainside, but the quiet, repetitive virtue of skilled work. Each sister brought a slightly different flavor to this shared devotion. Orchomenos might have been the most precise, her patterns flawless and her threads perfectly even, finding a kind of spiritual peace in absolute control. Arcip could have been the most competitive, driven to produce more and finer cloth than anyone, her pride woven into every inch of tapestry. And Alcathoe, perhaps the most vocal, might have articulated their shared belief that real strength lay in this tangible, daily discipline. Together, they formed a perfect unit of domestic industry, a living monument to their father's values and their city's ethos. Their loyalty was to the shuttle, the spindle, and the tangible proof of their labor. In their eyes, the new god's followers were abandoning their posts, trading responsibility for a dangerous and unproductive frenzy. They saw not worship, but willful idleness, and they wanted no part of it. The sound that drifted down from Mount Cithaeron was unlike anything Orchomenos had ever heard. It was the pulse of drums, the sharp cry of flutes, and the ecstatic shouts of women who had left their looms and their homes behind. This was the arrival of Dionysus, a god who was not merely visiting, but fundamentally rewriting the rules of reality. He was not a local deity of harvest or hearth, but a conqueror of the spirit, returning from the mystic east with a power that could not be contained by city walls. His domain was the vineyard and the wild mountain, the intoxicating release of wine and the raw, unfiltered truth of the theater. He represented a potent and terrifying form of liberation, one that dissolved the rigid lines separating man from woman, citizen from foreigner, the civilized self from the primal instincts within. Where the Minyades built their identity on control and production, Dionysus offered surrender and experience. His very presence was an invitation to tear down the inner fences, to join his wild retinue, his thyasos, in dances that lasted until dawn. This sacred band of followers, the Minyades, moved in a state of divine madness, their hair loose, their bodies clad in fawn skins, believed to possess superhuman strength. Alongside them, the playful, half-animal satyrs added a layer of chaotic joy. To the devout, this was Holy Communion. To the princesses in their quiet chamber, it was the sound of the world coming undone. The entire region of Boeotia was being swept up in this divine frenzy, a wave of ecstasy crashing against the orderly shores of cities like Orchomenos. The god's call was an open invitation to all, a command to abandon duty and embrace rapture. For Lukon, Arsipa, and Alcathoe, steadfast at their looms, that invitation was not a blessing. It was the ultimate test of their convictions. The rhythmic clack of their shuttles was a fortress against the chaos outside. Then the sound pierced their sanctuary. It was not just distant noise now, but a presence at the very threshold of their chamber. Perhaps the air grew thick with the scent of ivy and crushed grapes, or a strange, euphoric light seemed to seep under the door. The call was no longer an abstract rumor from the hills. It was a direct, personal summons. A voice, whether from a human priestess radiant with divine fervor or from the very walls themselves, echoed the god's command. Leave your work, come to the mountain, join the revel, become free. Lucono's hands did not falter. Arsip did not look up from her pattern. It was Alcato, perhaps, who voiced their collective scorn. She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound against the backdrop of ecstatic cries. "Look at them," she said, or one of her sisters did. "They have abandoned their children, their husbands, their duty. They run wild like animals, claiming it is holiness. It is mere madness and sloth. Our worship is here. Our devotion is real." They lifted their fine linen, their intricate tapestries, as if presenting evidence in a trial. "This is our offering. This is our piety. We serve Athena, goddess of wisdom and craft, who values the work of skilled hands. Let the foolish play in the woods. We will create something of lasting worth." In that moment, they did not just decline an invitation. They passed a verdict. They declared the god's sacred rites inferior, his divine ecstasy a shameful fraud. They placed the tangible product of the loom above the intangible experience of the spirit. To Dionysus, this was the ultimate blasphemy. He was not a god who accepted polite disinterest. His gift was the liberation of the soul. And to reject it outright was to insult the very core of his power. Their prideful loyalty to Athena was the final provocation, a direct challenge to his authority. The disciplined rhythm of the loom had just declared war on the wild rhythm of the heart, and a god does not lose such wars. The air in the chamber grew cold. The threads on their loom seemed to shiver, though no draft stirred the hanging fabrics. The first invisible crack had appeared in their world of perfect order. Their defiance did not go unanswered. The first warning was subtle, almost beautiful. As Luconoe reached for her spindle, the fine flax thread in her hand seemed to shimmer, then twist of its own accord. Before her eyes, it thickened, turning a deep, vibrant green, sprouting tiny leaves. It was no longer thread, but a living tendril of ivy curling around her wrist. Across the room, the pristine white wool on Arsipe's loom began to darken, staining a rich purple red, and the air filled with the unmistakable, heavy scent of fermenting grapes. It was as if the essence of the vineyard had poured itself into their chamber. They stared, not with awe, but with a craftsman's irritation. They brushed the ivy away. They sniffed at the stained wool in disgust. They muttered about poor materials and strange drafts, refusing to see the miracle for what it was, a gentle, tangible whisper from the god. He was showing them his power could create life from their tools of order. He was offering them a chance to see the wonder in his domain. They chose to see only a ruined afternoon's work. The warnings escalated. On the walls, their own tapestries, those proud testaments to their skill, began to shift. the woven scenes of heroic battles and peaceful harvests blurred, the threads rearranging themselves. Now the images showed frenzied dances under a full moon, figures with wild hair and flowing robes, faces twisted in joy, not pain. The sound of distant rhythmic drumming, the very heartbeat of the Dionysian rites, pulsed through the stone floor, growing louder until it vibrated in their teeth. It was an auditory invasion, a rhythm that demanded the body move. Yet the sisters only clamped their hands over their ears, weaving faster, their own movements becoming a frantic, desperate counter-rhythm to the divine pulse. They told each other it was a trick of the mind, a collective fatigue. The smell of wine became so thick it was dizzying, a sweet, cloying fog that promised release. One might have felt a strange warmth in her blood, a fleeting, terrifying urge to laugh and let go. But she crushed it immediately, channeling that surge of energy into a furious, perfect stitch. Each sign was a door held open, a final, merciful attempt to show them the ecstasy that awaited without force. Dionysus was demonstrating that his world was not destruction, but a different, vibrant kind of creation. He was meeting them on their own terms, using their looms and their tapestries as his canvas. Their stubbornness turned these acts of divine communication into insults. They were not just refusing a party, they were denying a fundamental truth he was placing before their eyes. In their determination to remain sane and industrious, they failed to recognize the most important warning of all, the one written in living vines and beating drums. Their sanity itself was becoming a cage, and the god would not ask politely again. The gentle warnings ceased all at once. In their place came a searing heat, a pressure building behind their eyes, as if their skulls were a wineskin about to burst. This was not an invitation, it was an invasion. Dionysus, his patience exhausted, struck them with a divine frenzy of his own making, a madness the Greeks called lyssa, the same raging fury that drove rabid dogs. But this was not the liberating ecstasy of the Minyades on the mountain, a shared communion with the god. This was a private, punitive hell, a mirror held up to their deepest fears. Their ordered world did not crumble from the outside in, it erupted from within. The first thread of the tapestry of their minds snapped. Leuconoe looked down at her hands, and the smooth shuttle she held was no longer wood and thread. It writhed, cold and scaly, a viper coiling around her fingers. She screamed, flinging it away, but the horror was everywhere. The baskets of soft wool at their feet seethed and hissed, becoming a nest of serpents. The very beams of the loom seemed to twist into slithering wooden reptiles. Their sanctuary, the seat of their reason and control, had become a pit of phantoms. The rhythmic clack of the loom was drowned out by a roaring in their ears, the sound of a phantom river rushing through the chamber, though the floor was dry. They saw spectral bulls, creatures of Dionysus, stampeding through the walls that could not contain them. The clean, geometric patterns of the room melted into swirling, oppressive colors. Where the true Minyades found unity in their madness, the sisters found only profound, terrifying isolation. Each was trapped in a personal nightmare, unable to see or hear her sister's reality, alone in a crowd of hallucinations. The disciplined focus that once produced beautiful tapestries was now a weapon turned against them, their minds weaving horrors from thin air. They had scorned the external dance, so the god forced them into an internal one, a dance of sheer, unadulterated terror. Their bodies began to move, but not with the graceful, purposeful motions of the weaver. They jerked and spasmed, driven by invisible lashes. Their cries not songs of joy, but raw, animal shrieks of panic. The ecstasy they denied was a vine that connected one to the god and to the tribe. The madness they received was a rootless, choking weed that grew only in the dark soil of their own pride. In this state of lyssa, a single, irresistible impulse seized them, a final, grotesque twist in the god's sentence. Their shattered minds, fixated on the product of their labor, on the proof of their domestic virtue, latched on to the one task that still made a terrible, twisted sense. The madness distilled their world into a single, horrific idea. Their frenzied minds, still clinging to the concept of ritual and offering, sought to appease the god they had enraged. But their understanding of worship was now a shattered mirror. They would not offer wine or song, the gifts of his true followers. Their twisted logic, born of Lyssa, fixated on the only thing they now believed held value, the ultimate product of their domestic lives, their own children. In the flickering, unreliable light of their chamber, amidst the phantom serpents and the roar of spectral rivers, they performed a ghastly ritual of their own invention. They gathered lots, perhaps broken shuttles or scraps of blood-red wool, and cast them in a perverse imitation of sacred chants. Each sister was a participant in this monstrous lottery, her maternal identity completely submerged by the punitive madness. The instinct to protect was silenced by the divine fury screaming in their veins. They watched the lots fall not with horror, but with a terrifying, vacant intensity, as if determining which piece of cloth to cut next. When the lot singled out Leucona's young son, Hippasus, the decision was met not with weeping, but with a grim, unanimous nod. The madness had achieved its most complete victory, severing the deepest human bond in the name of a deranged appeasement. It was the final, terrible inversion of their values. They, who had prized creation above all else, were now preparing to destroy their own creation in a desperate, insane attempt to buy back order. This was no longer just a punishment from a god. It was a crime authored by their own hands, a line crossed that made their fate irrevocable. The story now plunged from tragedy into the realm of the unforgivable. The lot fell, and the world narrowed to a single, terrible point. Hippasus, the young son of Leuconoe, stood before his mother and aunts. But in their eyes, he was no longer a child. He was the chosen offering, the only piece of their shattered reality that held any meaning. The divine madness, the Lyssa, stripped away every layer of civilized restraint, every instinct of protection. What surged forward in its place was a raw, ritualistic hunger. They did not use a blade, an instrument of clean sacrifice. Their hands, the very hands that once wove delicate threads and comforted a crying boy, became the weapons. They seized him. There was no ceremony, only a horrific, physical frenzy. The act was a brutal dismantling, a tearing apart of flesh and bone that mirrored the tearing apart of their own minds and their family. The sound that filled the chamber was not the ecstatic cry of Minyades, but something far more chilling, the ultimate silence of broken bonds. In that moment, every virtue they had championed was annihilated. They were the guardians of the hearth, now defiling it with the most profound taboo. They were the nurturers of the next generation, now destroying it. This was not merely murder, it was the complete and utter inversion of the natural and social order they had so fiercely defended. Their madness had authored the very chaos they sought to keep outside their walls, proving that the wildness they feared was not just on the mountain, but a potential sleeping within every ordered heart. The loom of their lives, once weaving a tapestry of duty and lineage, had produced its final, monstrous pattern. The horror of their own actions finally broke the fever of madness. In the sudden, awful silence that followed the frenzy, clarity returned, a cold and brutal dawn. They looked at their hands, stained and trembling, and at the ruin they had created in their once orderly chamber. The phantom serpents were gone, the spectral river silent. Only the real, unspeakable evidence remained. A wave of pure, consuming terror washed over them, a terror not of the god, but of themselves. They had to escape, to flee the scene of their crime and the condemning light of the sun. As one, they stumbled from the palace, out into the gray pre-dawn of the orchards and fields that bordered the city. They ran not as princesses, but as hunted things. their fine robes torn and soiled, their minds shattered by the memory of what their hands had done. They sought the deepest shadows, the hidden places away from all eyes. It was there, in that desperate flight, that the god delivered his final poetic sentence. As they scrambled towards a grove of trees, perhaps a stand of ancient oaks or a thicket of pines, the world around them began to warp once more. But this was no hallucination. The air itself grew heavy and tangible, pressing in on them. Their cries for mercy turned thin and sharp, rising in pitch until they were no longer human sounds. Their bodies, which had moved with such violent, clumsy force, suddenly felt insubstantial. They watched in mute horror as their own arms began to change. The skin darkened, tightening and drying into a thin, leathery membrane that stretched painfully between their elongating fingers. Their fine bones grew hollow and light, their forms shrinking, collapsing inward. Their prized robes, symbols of their station, fell away as useless rags. In moments, the transformation was complete. Where three sisters had stood, now three small, frantic shapes fluttered erratically in the dim light. They had become bats. The symbolism was perfect, a divine judgment written in their new forms. They had rejected the sunlit world of duty and visible labor, so now they were condemned to the night, creatures of shadow and secrecy. Their orderly loom room, a place of geometric precision, was replaced by the chaotic, upside-down world of dark caves and tangled tree hollows. The rhythmic, productive clack of the shuttle was exchanged for the silent, erratic flutter of wings. They had prized human community and family above the gods' wild tribe, and now they were made into solitary, alien things that frightened people, misunderstood and driven into isolation. Even their new voices were a mockery of human speech, reduced to high-pitched clicks and squeaks used only for navigating darkness. In some versions of the myth, they were also transformed into owls, birds sacred to their patroness Athena, but as creatures of ominous night, not wise day. This double transformation sealed their fate as eternal outcasts, belonging wholly to neither the civilized world they championed nor the divine ecstasy they scorned, but forever trapped in the liminal gloom between. The city awoke to a silence more terrifying than any revel. The princesses were gone, vanished from their chamber, but they left behind a story written in signs no one could ignore. The loom room, once a symbol of royal virtue, stood as a grim tableau. The unfinished tapestries, the scattered tools, and the undeniable, unspeakable evidence of violence told a tale far worse than simple disappearance. Word spread through Orchomenos in horrified whispers, then in panicked shouts. The daughters of King Minyas, the very embodiments of the city's disciplined ideals, had not just denied a god, they had committed the most profound atrocity imaginable before being erased from the world of men. This was not a private family tragedy. It was a divine plague that had breached the palace walls. The entire city now stood implicated in their offense. The god's wrath had been proven real, and it was catastrophically close. Fear, cold and practical, replaced their former disdain. The rhythmic clack of the loom now sounded like a countdown to further disaster. If such a fate could befall the king's own daughters, protected by their station and their famed piety, then no one in Orchomenos was safe. The myth they had dismissed as foreign nonsense was now their terrifying reality. The community faced a stark choice: continue in stubborn defiance and risk utter annihilation, or surrender to the gods' power and beg for mercy. Their survival instinct chose the latter. To prevent the complete unraveling of their society, the people of Orchomenos had to perform the ultimate act of cultural contrition. They had to welcome the very force they had tried to shut out. Thus began the city's desperate official embrace of Dionysus. Priests were summoned, rites were studied. The wild mountain celebrations they had scorned were now formally integrated into the city's religious calendar. A temple, or at the very least a sacred precinct, was likely dedicated to the god within the city limits, a tangible anchor for his volatile power. The establishment of state-sanctioned Dionysian cults served as a circuit breaker for divine fury. These were not the unchecked Minyadic frenzies of the hills, but organized, ritualized channels for the same ecstatic energy. They created a controlled space for the madness, a societal pressure valve. The city that prized order above all else learned to schedule chaos, to give the wild god his due time and place, thereby protecting the rest of the year's orderly flow. In this way, the horrifying fate of the Minyades became the foundational story, the Asian, that explained and enforced religious practice for generations. Parents would point to the bats flitting at dusk and whisper the tale, a warning to their children about the cost of insulting the gods. The festival of the Agrionia, celebrated in parts of Boeotia, involved rituals of pursuit and was said by some to commemorate this very myth. The story was no longer just about three stubborn women. It was the city's collective trauma, repurposed as a lesson in survival. It taught that some forces are too fundamental to deny, that the human psyche contains wildness that must be acknowledged, lest it erupt in far more destructive ways. By ritualizing the surrender the princesses refused, Orchomenos found a way to live with the god, transforming a story of personal damnation into a manual for civic salvation. But where does this chilling version of the story actually come from? The most vivid and complete account we have is not from ancient Greece itself, but from a Roman poet writing centuries later during the reign of Emperor Augustus. His name was Publius Ovidius Naso, known to us as Ovid, and he wove the tale of the Minyades into his monumental 15-book masterpiece, the Metamorphoses. It is in Book 4 of this epic poem that we find the sisters' story preserved in all its terrifying detail. Ovid was a master storyteller, less a historian of religion and more a psychological dramatist. He collected myths from across the Mediterranean, refashioning them with a Roman sensibility and a flair for the visceral. For him, these were not dry religious texts, but raw material for exploring human passion, divine power, and the moment when one becomes the other. His version of the Minyades is therefore not a simple retelling. It is an interpretation, layered with his own poetic genius and the tastes of his audience. He gives the princesses distinct voices and a lengthy, defiant conversation, something rarely found in earlier, fragmentary Greek sources. We hear their scorn in their own words as they mock the gods' followers, calling them fools and impostors. This dialogue is Ovid's invention, a brilliant device that makes their hubris feel personal and immediate, rather than a distant cultural stance. He then lingers on the transformation itself, with a sensory horror that is uniquely his. He describes the shrinking of their bodies, the darkening of their skin into membrane, the way their forms grow indistinct and flutter into the shadows. He makes us see and feel the metamorphosis, grounding the supernatural in startlingly physical terms. This focus on the bodily change is central to Ovid's entire project. The Metamorphoses is, after all, a poem about bodies in flux. For the modern world, Ovid's version is overwhelmingly the most influential. When we think of the Minyades, we're almost always thinking through Ovid's eyes, hearing their defiance in his crafted dialogue, and witnessing their punishment through his vivid, unsettling imagery. He took a local Boeotian warning and elevated it into a universal story about the catastrophic cost of denying transformative forces, whether they come from a god or from within our own repressed nature. His embellishments are not flaws. They are the very elements that gave the myth its lasting power, ensuring that the fate of three stubborn princesses would echo far beyond their own time and place. Yet Ovid's dramatic poem was not the only source preserving their fate. The myth also surfaces in the work of a far less famous but crucial collector, a Greek mythographer named Antoninus Liberalis. Living sometime in the 2nd century of our Common Era, Antoninus compiled a volume known as the Metamorphoses, sharing its name with Ovid's work, but structured as a straightforward collection of transformation myth. His account of the Minyades is strikingly similar in its core beats: the defiance, the madness, the horrific murder, and the final change into bats. This parallel tradition tells us something vital. The story was not a Roman invention. It had deep roots in Greek lore, circulating for centuries in various forms before both authors set it down. Antoninus serves as a key witness, confirming that Ovid was working with authentic mythological material, even as he shaped it with his own poetic flair. The existence of these two versions, one Roman and literary, one Greek and scholarly, shows the myth was a resilient piece of cultural memory, important enough to be recorded by very different writers for very different audiences. But the story's influence stretched even further, beyond the realm of myth and into the world of ancient science. We find a fascinating echo in the monumental natural history of Pliny the Elder, a 1st century Roman encyclopedist who attempted to catalogue all knowledge of the natural world. In his writings on animals, Pliny mentions bats, and he notes a curious belief that these creatures were once human women, transformed as punishment. He does not name the Minyades directly, but the connection is unmistakable. For Pliny, a man dedicated to observation and explanation, the myth was not merely a tale, it served as an etiological story, an ancient attempt to explain the natural world. Why do bats hide in darkness? Why do they seem so alien and unsettling? Well, the ancients reasoned, because they were once prideful women cursed by a god. This classification of the myth as a kind of proto-science reveals how deeply such stories were woven into the fabric of ancient thought. They were not just entertainment or religious parable, they were frameworks for understanding everything from animal behavior to the very boundaries between human and beast. The journey of the Minyades, from a local Boeotian warning to a subject for Roman poetry, and then to an entry in a scientific encyclopedia, demonstrates a profound truth. In the ancient mind, the line between myth, religion, and natural philosophy was beautifully, and often terrifyingly, blurred. Their transformation into bats was more than a punishment. It was a theological statement carved into flesh. At its deepest level, this myth is not merely a cautionary tale about respecting the gods. It is a foundational story about the inescapable architecture of reality itself. Dionysus represents something far more profound than just wine and parties. He embodies a fundamental, chaotic force woven into the very fabric of nature and the human psyche. He is the god of the vine, yes, but the vine is a metaphor for life's untamable, creative, destructive surge. The sap that rises in the spring, the fermentation that transforms juice, the ecstasy that breaks down the individual self to reconnect with something larger. This force cannot be reasoned with, bargained with, or walled out. It is as essential and as dangerous as a river. You can either build a channel for it, giving it a structured path through your community with festivals and rites, or you can pretend it does not exist and wait for the levee of your sanity to burst. The Minyades chose the latter. They built their entire identity on a dam against this primal current. Their looms, their schedules, their proud isolation were all bricks in that dam. The myth's brutal logic shows that the force denied does not disappear. It simply finds another, more catastrophic outlet. By refusing the gods' communal, ritualized ecstasy, the sacred madness of the Minyades on the mountain, they forced that energy to erupt within their own home, in the private, horrific madness of Lyssa. The divine frenzy, when welcomed, was a source of power and unity. When rejected, it became a punitive, isolating poison. Their crime was not simply impiety, it was a profound psychological error. They believed the wildness was outside of them, a foreign contagion to be avoided. The gods' punishment revealed the terrifying truth. The wildness was inside them all along. Their final forms as bats, creatures of the chaotic dark, are the perfect symbol of this internal exile. They became what they feared most, not by being conquered from without, but by having the hidden chaos within dragged screaming into the light and then frozen into a permanent shape. The myth, therefore, is an ancient blueprint for mental and social health. It argues that every ordered system, every civilized mind, contains a Dionysian element, a necessary chaos that must be acknowledged. To suppress it completely is not to achieve perfect order, but to create a pressure cooker. The rituals of Dionysus, the festivals like the Agrionia, were the pressure valves society built. They were designated times and spaces where the rules could be inverted, where emotions could run high, where the individual could dissolve into the crowd. This ritualized surrender safely discharged the very energies that, if pent up, could lead a person or an entire city to the kind of private, horrific breakdown suffered by the princesses. In the end, the story of the Minyades is a stark equation. Denying the god does not eliminate his power. It merely guarantees you will meet that power in its most destructive, personal, and unforgiving form. This brings us to a modern and deeply unsettling question. Was the punishment of the Minyades truly about impiety, or was it a mythic enforcement of patriarchal control? From a feminist perspective, this story reads as a brutal warning against female autonomy. These were women who made a conscious, collective choice. They asserted their right to define their own worship, to find sacred meaning not in the wild, public sphere of the male god, but in the skilled domestic craft of the loom. Their work was not idle. It was economically and socially vital, the very foundation of household wealth and stability. In choosing Athena over Dionysus, they were prioritizing a goddess of wisdom and strategy, one who represented a form of female power rooted in intellect and skill rather than ecstatic surrender. Their defiance can be seen not as hubris, but as an act of spiritual independence. They said no to a god whose rights demanded they abandon their home, their duties, and their rational minds. And for this assertion of agency, for this preference for a controlled, productive form of female power, they were systematically broken and destroyed. The sequence of their punishment is telling. First, their chosen medium, the loom and its products, is corrupted by the god, a violation of their creative space. Then, their minds are invaded with a madness that strips away their reason, the very faculty they prized. Finally, their bodies are transformed into something inhuman and reviled. It is a complete annihilation of the self they had built. The message seems clear. In the world of this myth, a woman's choice is only valid if it aligns with the dominant divine and social order. When it challenges that order, the retaliation is total. Yet the myth complicates this reading with its most horrific element, the murder of the child. This act, born of their divinely inflicted madness, forces us to confront another ancient ideal, the role of the mother. In their frenzy, the sisters fail in the most sacred duty assigned to women in their society, the protection of their young. Their autonomy, once expressed through nurturing domesticity, culminates in its utter opposite, the destruction of the family. So the myth delivers a devastating double bind. The princesses are punished first for asserting an independent, non-conformist female identity, and then are literally made to destroy the very thing that identity was meant to nurture. They are damned for being too independent, and then damned for being monstrously bad mothers. This reflects the impossible pressures of a patriarchal system. Female virtue is a narrow path between obedient piety and proper domesticity. Step outside to claim your own authority, and you are hubristic. Fail within the domestic sphere, and you are inhuman. The violent enforcement of religious conformity here is inseparable from the enforcement of gender roles. Dionysus does not just demand worship. He demands a specific kind of worship that requires women to leave their assigned posts, to become wild, public, and emotionally unrestrained, but only within the confines of his sanctioned ritual. The myth may ultimately be about the danger of repressing necessary chaos, but its narrative vehicle is the brutal dismantling of women who tried to channel that chaos into a form of their own making. Their story, then, becomes a dark mirror, reflecting ancient anxieties about female agency and the terrible price of stepping outside the loom's prescribed pattern. Their story is a psychological drama written in mythic symbols long before the language of modern therapy existed. If we view the myth through this lens, the three princesses cease to be merely disobedient worshippers and transform into archetypes of the conscious mind itself. They are the ego and the superego, personified, that part of us that manages daily reality, enforces rules, and seeks approval through productive, orderly behavior. Their loom room is not just a physical space, it is the carefully constructed chamber of a controlled psyche, where every thread is a thought, every pattern a predictable behavior. Their dedication to work and duty represents a life governed solely by should and must, where messy feelings, irrational desires, and raw instincts have no place. They are the ultimate repressors, believing that by ignoring the wilder parts of human nature, they can achieve a perfect, sterile state of being. Dionysus, then, is the eruption of everything they have locked away. He is the mythic embodiment of the ID, the unconscious reservoir of primal energy, instinct, and untamed emotion. He is not an external enemy, but the manifestation of their own suppressed selves. The call from the mountain is the call from within, an invitation to acknowledge the deep, chaotic wellspring of creativity, passion, and even rage that exists beneath the surface of civilized life. Their refusal is not just a religious snub, it is a profound psychological act of denial. They look at the ecstatic Minyades and see only madness, because they cannot recognize that same potential for surrender and release within themselves. They mistake integration for annihilation. The gods' initial warnings, the living ivy and the phantom drums, are the psyche's own attempts to signal that repression is failing. These are the symptoms of a strained mind, the strange impulses, the intrusive thoughts, the sense that the walls of one's carefully built identity are beginning to sweat and bulge with a pressure from below. When those gentle signals are angrily dismissed, the system breaks. The punitive madness, the Lyssa, is a full-blown psychotic break. It is the id, denied its proper channel, exploding through the defenses of the ego with catastrophic force. The orderly loom of the conscious mind is utterly overwhelmed by hallucinations of serpents and spectral bulls, symbols of the very instincts they feared. In this state, the superego's drive for a perverse, ritualistic order twists into its most horrific form, leading to the murder of the child, which can be seen as the destruction of their own future, their own potential for growth and connection. Their final transformation into bats is the ultimate psychological verdict. They become creatures of the shadowy in-between, forever severed from the sunlight of rational consciousness, yet not truly part of the divine unconscious they rejected. They are condemned to live as the very thing they refuse to integrate, a permanent state of fragmented, alienated being. In this reading, the myth becomes a timeless allegory for mental health. It warns that we cannot simply wall off the chaotic, emotional, and instinctual parts of ourselves. To try is to create a psychological pressure cooker. The energy of the id does not vanish. It distorts and seeks violent, unexpected outlets in nightmares, in sudden rages, in self-destructive behaviors, or in a complete shattering of one's sense of reality. The ancient Dionysian rites, for all their wildness, served a crucial therapeutic function for the community. They provided a sanctioned collective space for catharsis, a ritualized channel to express and release those primal energies in a way that ultimately reinforced social bonds rather than destroying the individual. The fate of the Minyades illustrates the opposite path, a cautionary tale of what happens when the dance is refused, when the music is silenced, and the self turns against itself in a war it can never win. The loom was never just a tool, it was a universe in miniature. In the hands of the princesses, each pull of the shuttle was an act of supreme ordering, taking the chaotic potential of raw wool and imposing a clear, beautiful pattern upon it. This act of weaving was one of the most potent symbols in the ancient world, layered with meaning. It represented human control over nature, the patient creation of culture from raw materials. But on a deeper, mythic level, weaving was also a metaphor for fate itself. The Greeks envisioned the Moirai, the three fates, as weavers. One spun the thread of a person's life, another measured its length, and the third cut it. Every tapestry, then, was a story being told, a destiny being literally constructed from countless individual choices and actions. Leukonoe, Arsip, and Alcathoe were not just making cloth, they were, in their own eyes, weaving the very narrative of their lives. Each tight, perfect stitch was a declaration of their values, a thread in a tapestry that depicted a life of discipline, productivity, and rational piety. They believed they were crafting a masterpiece of virtuous destiny, a story with a clear and honorable ending, sanctioned by their patroness, Athena, the goddess of craft and wisdom. Their chamber was a sacred studio where they authored their own futures, one thread at a time, believing their control was absolute. Dionysus did not attack them with fire or earthquake. His assault was far more precise and far more insulting. He attacked their story. His first act was to unravel their work. When the threads on their looms transformed into living ivy and the scent of wine soaked the wool, it was not mere magic, it was a symbolic coup. The god was demonstrating that his power, the raw, untamed force of nature, could overwrite their cultural creation. The vines, snaking from the shuttle, declared that physis, wild nature, would always overpower techne, human craft, if the craft denies nature's fundamental power. He took the very symbol of their order and made it a symbol of his own chaotic, fertile world. He was unpicking the tapestry of their carefully constructed identities, thread by thread. The phantom images that appeared on their wall hangings, showing Dionysian revels, were a direct hijacking of their narrative. He was rewriting their story on their own medium, showing them a different destiny, one of ecstatic surrender, which they furiously rejected. This unraveling reached its peak with the punitive madness, the Lyssa. If their conscious minds were the weavers, then this divine frenzy was a pair of shears, slashing through the warp and weft of their sanity. The orderly patterns of thought, the predictable connections, the whole logical design of their inner world came completely undone. They could no longer tell memory from hallucination, child from offering, self from monster. The tapestry was in tatters. Their final metamorphosis into bats is the completion of this symbolic destruction. A finished tapestry is a coherent whole, a single, integrated object meant to be seen and understood. A bat is a fragmented, alien creature of echoes and shadows. The transformation dissolves the final, integrated form of their human selves, the ultimate masterpiece of their lives, and leaves behind only these scattered, nocturnal shards. There is no pattern here, only frantic, isolated movement in the dark. They have become the opposite of a weaver. They are now creatures that inhabit the chaotic spaces between threads, in the gloom where no clear design can be seen. The orderly tapestry of their lives, woven with such pride and certainty, was not just taken down from the wall, it was annihilated at the level of its very fiber, its fundamental threads transformed into something that could never again be woven into a coherent story. Their fate stands as a permanent warning, written in the language of symbol, that any narrative of the self which completely denies the wild, the irrational, and the instinctual is not a stronger story, but a fragile one, waiting for a god or the unconscious to pull a single, crucial thread and watch the entire design disintegrate into fluttering, formless night. Their metamorphosis into bats was a choice loaded with ancient dread. In the Greek imagination, these were not just animals, they were creatures of profound ambiguity, belonging to the chthonic realm, the shadowy world beneath the earth. They were seen as ill-omened, associated with ghosts and the dead, perhaps because they dwelled in caves, the very portals to the underworld. To become a bat was to be cast out of the human community and into a domain of spirits and bad luck, a perfect symbol for the sisters' exile from both civilization and divine grace. This fear was not unique to Greece. Across cultures, the bat's hybrid nature, a mammal with wings, has inspired unease. In some Mesoamerican traditions, bats were linked to the night, death, and sacrifice. In parts of Europe, they were familiars of witches, or their very forms. Yet this perception is fascinatingly one-sided when held against biological reality. Bats are indeed nocturnal, which aligned perfectly with the ancient view of them as creatures of darkness and hidden things. They are also highly social, living in complex colonies, a detail the myth ignores to emphasize the sisters' isolation. Their unique method of navigation, echolocation, would have seemed utterly alien and supernatural to ancient peoples, a form of seeing in the dark that defied human understanding. This biological strangeness, this seeming defiance of natural categories, made them the ideal vessel for a story about transcending, or rather, being cast down from, the human condition. The myth taps into a universal human curiosity and fear of the other, of the creature that lives in our world, but follows rules we cannot comprehend. By linking the fate of the Minyades to such an inherently mysterious animal, the storytellers ensured their punishment would resonate on a visceral, almost primal level. Every time an ancient Greek saw a bat flit silently at dusk, they were reminded of the price of defiance, of the thin line between a disciplined human and a creature of the chaotic dark. The symbol worked because the animal itself seemed to hold a secret, a truth about the world that was just beyond the reach of the orderly, sunlit mind. The fate of the Minyades was not a singular tragedy, but part of a terrifying pattern in ancient mythology. Stories of mortals punished for denying or insulting the gods form a dark constellation across the sky of world folklore, each one a warning flare against the human temptation of hubris. Consider the story of Niobe, a queen of Thebes. She boasted that she was superior to the goddess Leto because she had 14 beautiful children, while Leto had only 2. For this act of pride, for placing her mortal fertility above a divine mother, Apollo and Artemis, Leto's twin children, descended with their bows. They slaughtered every one of Niobe's sons and daughters. The queen, turned to stone by her grief, wept eternally. Her punishment was a direct response to a verbal boast, a public challenge to a goddess's honor. The Minyades' crime was quieter but no less severe, a private, sustained rejection of a god's very essence. Then there is Pentheus, the young king of Thebes in Euripides' great play, the Bacchae. His story is the male mirror to that of the princesses. He too denies the divinity of Dionysus, dismissing the god's rites as a corrupting excuse for female licentiousness. He tries to use force, imprisonment, and espionage to suppress the cult. His end is eerily similar, yet crucially different. Lured by Dionysus to spy on the Minyades, he is discovered, sent into a madness by the god, and torn apart by the frenzied worshippers, led by his own mother, Agave. Both stories involve denial, madness, and dismemberment. But Pentheus is an active political suppressor, a ruler trying to stamp out a threat to civic order. The Minyades are passive resistors, withdrawing into their domestic sphere and simply refusing to participate. Pentheus is destroyed from without by the communal force he tried to ban. The princesses are destroyed from within, their madness turning them against their own kin in the privacy of their home. The gendered dynamic is stark. Pentheus, the man, is punished through the women he feared, made a victim of the wild feminine power he scorned. The Minyades, the women, are punished by being forced to embody a perversion of that same power, destroying the family they were meant to nurture. Another poignant parallel is Actaeon, the hunter who stumbled upon the virgin goddess Artemis bathing. His crime was not denial, but accidental violation, seeing what was forbidden. His punishment was transformation, turned into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. Like the princesses, his human form is taken, and he is destroyed by what was once his own, his hunting dogs mirroring the sisters' murderous turn against their domestic role. What threads connect all these tales? Hubris, certainly, that overweening pride that places mortal judgment above divine will. But more specifically, they are stories about boundaries. Niobe crossed the boundary between mortal and divine honor. Actaeon crossed a boundary of sacred privacy. Pentheus and the Minyades crossed the ultimate boundary, attempting to veto a god's right to worship. The unique horror of the Minyades' story lies in its intimate, psychological location. Their defiance was not a public proclamation or a political edict. It was a quiet, daily choice at the loom. Their punishment, therefore, did not play out on a mountain or in a palace courtyard, but in the very chamber that symbolized their safe, ordered world. It turned their virtues into the instruments of their damnation. This comparative view reveals the myth's specific, chilling message. While kings might be torn apart by mobs and hunters devoured by hounds, these princesses were unraveled by their own hands, in their own home, for the crime of believing their quiet, productive order was stronger than the wild, sacred chaos of the world. While their story was woven in words, the myth of the Minyades also left a powerful mark on the visual arts, a testament to its enduring grip on the imagination. In the ancient world, the most vivid glimpses we get are on Greek pottery. Imagine a red figure vase from the 5th century before the Common Era. The scene is not the bloody finale, but the tense moment before the madness. It shows the three sisters seated together at their looms, their postures rigid with focus. They are often depicted ignoring a divine messenger, perhaps a winged figure of Dionysus himself or a frantic Maenad who has burst into their chamber. The contrast is the entire story. Here, the ordered geometry of the loom frames the women, while the intruder brings the wild, dynamic energy of the god. The vase painter captures the central conflict, the clash between domestic space and divine invasion, all in a single, silent image. These ancient artists understood the power of the pivotal moment, the last second of normalcy before the world unravels. The transformation into bats, a difficult scene to render, appears less frequently, but the presence of the god and the tension of refusal were clear enough to convey the myth's terrible warning to anyone who drank from that cup. Centuries later, the myth experienced a spectacular rebirth during the Renaissance and Baroque periods. As artists and scholars rediscovered classical texts, Ovid's Metamorphoses became a favorite source book. The story of the Minyades, with its dramatic tension and shocking transformation, was perfect for the era's love of movement, emotion, and theatricality. One fascinating early depiction comes from the strange and beautiful Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, a Renaissance romance published in 1499. Its author, Francesco Colonna, included an elaborate description of a tapestry depicting the Minyades, forever weaving in their doomed chamber. This literary artwork within an artwork shows how the myth had become a symbol of tragic, misguided dedication. Later, in the 17th century, the Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens, who adored Ovid's tales, likely sketched or painted the scene, drawn to its potential for expressing frenzied emotion and physical change. But some of the most direct visualizations come from illustrated editions of the metamorphoses itself. Baroque engravers would depict the sisters in the throes of their transformation, their bodies caught between human and beast, their fine robes falling away as leathery wings sprout from their arms. The artists focused on the horror and confusion on their faces, the dramatic lighting casting long shadows as they fluttered toward a dark architectural niche. These images served a dual purpose. They brought Ovid's poetry to life for readers, and they cemented the myth's visual identity as one of terrifying, divine retribution. For a modern video showing this progression, from the stark elegance of a Greek vase to the swirling drama of a Baroque engraving, would visually trace the journey of the story itself, from an ancient cautionary tale to a timeless emblem of psychological metamorphosis. The thread of this ancient story did not break with Ovid or the Baroque engravers. It wove itself silently into the fabric of modern literature, finding new forms in our contemporary anxieties. Poets, those weavers of psychological landscapes, have been particularly drawn to its dark tapestry. The British poet Ted Hughes, with his raw elemental focus on the clash between the civilized and the animalistic, often channeled this very tension. In his collection Crow, or in poems like the Bacchus, one can feel the specter of Dionysus, that force that shatters polite facades. Hughes did not need to name the Minyades directly. The myth's core engine, the violent eruption of the repressed, powered his entire poetic universe. He gave voice to the bull and the river, the very forces that flooded the princess's chamber, reminding a modern audience that the loom room of the rational mind is a fragile construction. The myth's structure, that of a meticulously maintained order shattered by an uncontrollable primal force, is the bedrock of entire genres we consume today. Think of the finest psychological horror. A successful lawyer, a model of control and ambition, begins to hear a faint, rhythmic drumming in the walls of his sleek apartment. A celebrated artist, renowned for her precise technical mastery, finds the colors on her canvas beginning to bleed and shift of their own accord, showing her visions she desperately tried to forget. These are not ghost stories in the traditional sense. They are Minyades narratives for the modern age. The horror does not come from a monster under the bed, but from the terrifying realization that the monster has been inside the psyche all along, and the careful life built to keep it contained is suddenly, irrevocably, full of cracks. The genre of domestic drama, too, thrives on this ancient template. A family dedicated to the appearance of perfect harmony, their home a showpiece of order, finds that harmony unraveling not from an external affair or financial ruin, but from a silent, seething pressure within. A repressed grief, a denied addiction, a secret fury, these are the Dionysian forces in a cardigan and slippers. When they finally erupt, they do so not with tambourines on a mountain, but with a devastating argument at the dinner table or a quiet, irreversible act of betrayal. The transformation in these stories is rarely physical, but it is no less complete. The loving mother becomes a stranger of cold indifference. The dependable father becomes a vessel of unpredictable rage. They are metaphorically transformed, their human shapes occupied by something their family no longer recognizes. This is why the myth feels so chillingly contemporary. We have replaced the god with the unconscious, the divine madness with a mental health crisis, the physical metamorphosis into a bat with the social and emotional metamorphosis into an outcast. The warning remains identical. A life built solely on the suppression of deep, difficult truths is not a stable life. It is a prelude to a collapse. The modern iterations ask the same question Ovid did 2,000 years ago. What happens when the music you have spent your life ignoring finally becomes so loud you can no longer hear anything else? The answer, as the three princesses learned, is written not in the stars, but in the unraveling of your own mind. The world they refused was one of sacred, sanctioned abandon. To understand the depth of their crime, we must step outside the palace walls and onto the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, into the very heart of the Dionysian rites. This was not mere partying, it was a complex religious phenomenon called the Orchomenos, the mountain dancing. Women, primarily, would leave their cities and homes, answering the gods' call to the wilderness. They dressed in fawn skins, a symbolic shedding of their civilized identities to connect with the raw vitality of nature. In their hands, they carried the thyrsus, a staff tipped with a pine cone and wreathed in ivy or vine leaves. This was no walking stick. It was a potent symbol of the gods' dual power, the fertile, intoxicating life of the vine and the enduring, evergreen strength of the pine. The rhythmic pounding of feet on the earth, the shaking of tambourines, the sharp cry of the flute, this was the soundtrack of their worship. Through this relentless communal dance, they sought a state known as enthusiasmos, literally, having the god within. This was the goal, a transcendent ecstasy where the individual self dissolved and the dancer became a vessel for Dionysus himself. In this state, they were believed to possess superhuman strength, able to tear apart animals with their bare hands in a ritual sparagmos, or to draw milk and honey from the earth with their thyrsus staffs. For the participants, this was the ultimate liberation, a temporary but complete freedom from the rigid hierarchies and daily constraints of Greek society. It was a spiritual explosion that reaffirmed their connection to the life force of the world. Now, hold that image in your mind. The collective roar on the mountain, the shared sweat and ecstasy, the feeling of divine power coursing through 100 bodies moving as one. Then look back into the quiet, sunlit chamber of the princesses. Their world was defined by walls, by the measured click of the shuttle, by individual achievement measured in bolts of cloth. Their worship was silent, private, and productive. They created objects, while the Minyades sought an experience. They upheld the social structure of the household, while the Minyades temporarily obliterated all social roles. The princesses saw only chaos and shame in the mountain rites, a dangerous negation of everything that gave their lives meaning. But from the Dionysian perspective, the princesses' crime was not just disobedience, it was a profound spiritual poverty. They clung to their tiny, self-made tapestries while rejecting the chance to become part of the god's living, breathing masterpiece. They chose the safety of the loom over the terrifying, glorious risk of the dance. In denying the call to the mountain, they weren't just insulting a deity, they were rejecting a fundamental human need for collective ecstasy, for a connection to the wild that exists both in nature and within the human soul. Their confined domestic virtue was a wall against a sacred storm, and the myth asks a haunting question: what good is a fortress if it cages the very spirit it was meant to protect? But what if the soil itself could whisper a version of their story? The city of Orchomenos is not a myth. It is a real place you can visit in the central Greek region of Boeotia. Its ruins tell a tale of astonishing wealth and power that long predates the classical era of Athens and Sparta. The most striking evidence is the so-called treasury of Minyas, a magnificent beehive-shaped tomb, a tholos built from massive, finely fitted stones. This structure is not just a grave, it is a declaration. It rivals the famous treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, signaling that Orchomenos was a major palatial center during the Mycenaean period, the age of heroes that Homer would later sing about, roughly from the 16th to the 12th centuries before the Common Era. This was a city of warrior kings and immense agricultural riches, controlling the fertile Copaic plain. The discipline and industry the myth attributes to the Minyai. That likely stems from a historical truth. This was a powerful, organized, and conservative society, with a deep investment in maintaining its established order. Then, catastrophe struck. Around the end of the 12th century, the entire Mycenaean world collapsed. Palaces were burned, writing disappeared, trade networks shattered. This was the onset of the Greek Dark Ages, a period of fragmentation, migration, and profound cultural forgetting that lasted for centuries. It is in the murky emergence from this darkness in the 8th and 7th centuries that the cult of Dionysus, with its roots in Thrace and Phrygia, began to spread powerfully into mainland Greece. This was not a peaceful integration. The arrival of this ecstatic, foreign god would have been a seismic event for any traditional, agrarian-based community clinging to old ways. The myth of the Minyades, set in this very city of ancient conservative wealth, could be a distant, distorted memory of that real cultural trauma. It may encode a historical moment when the old, established order of Orchomenos, symbolized by the palace and the loom, violently resisted the new, disruptive religious force from the north, symbolized by Dionysus. The prince's defiance might reflect the stance of a priestly or aristocratic class, trying to protect the ancestral worship of local deities like the Graces or Athena from a foreign invader god. Their horrific fate would then serve as an etiological myth invented later to explain and justify why the city eventually did adopt the Dionysian cult, why those wild rites became part of the official religious calendar. The story says, "We resisted, and the consequences were so terrible we had no choice but to yield." Archaeology cannot dig up a divine punishment, but it can uncover the layers of a city that knew great wealth, experienced collapse, and later had to negotiate its place in a changing world where new gods demanded recognition. The myth, then, is not a history book, but a psychological fossil preserving the deep emotional imprint of a community's reluctant surrender to a force it could not, in the end, control. The true lesson of this myth is not a command to blindly obey, it is a sophisticated psychological plea for balance. The ancient Greeks had a word for this ideal, sophrosine. It meant soundness of mind, self-control, and, most importantly, moderation. This was not about denying any part of human experience, but about harmonizing them. The three princesses represent one dangerous extreme, a life of absolute, rigid control. They built a fortress of routine and productivity, but in doing so, they walled out every spontaneous impulse, every raw emotion, every hint of chaos. Their world was all Apollo, the god of reason, light, and clear boundaries. The Minyades on the mountain represent the opposite extreme, a state of complete, ecstatic abandon. Their world was all Dionysus, a surrender to emotion, instinct, and the dissolution of the self. The myth does not ultimately champion either side. It shows the catastrophic result when one extreme utterly rejects the other. The princesses' fatal error was not their dedication to work, but their total, contemptuous denial of the Dionysian element within themselves and their world. They believed they could live entirely in the sunlight of reason, with no shadow, no cellar, no wild root system feeding the tree of their lives. The gods' punishment revealed the flaw in that logic. By refusing to acknowledge the wildness, they did not eliminate it. They forced it to grow in the dark, twisted and toxic, until it erupted in a madness that destroyed everything they held dear. So what is the solution? The myth points toward integration, not exclusion. The healthy city, and by extension the healthy mind, finds a way to give the Dionysian its due. This is where ritual becomes vital. The wild mountain revels were not daily life, they were sacred, time-limited exceptions. The festivals, like the Agrionia, created a structured communal container for the chaos. For a few designated days, the rules could be inverted. emotions could run high, and people could experience that liberating ecstasy within a framework that ultimately returned them to society. It was a pressure valve. This ritualized moderation allowed the passion and creativity of Dionysus to flow into the community in a way that enriched it rather than tearing it apart. It fed the arts, especially tragedy and comedy, which were performed in his honor. It acknowledged that creativity itself is a kind of divine madness, a necessary surrender to something beyond pure logic. The myth, therefore, is a blueprint for psychological sustainability. It argues that a complete life requires both the shuttle and the thyrsus. We need the discipline to weave our days into coherent stories, to build, to plan, to maintain. But we also need the wisdom to occasionally put the shuttle down. We need to acknowledge the inner drumbeat, to make space for passion, for grief, for joy so intense it feels irrational, for creative impulses that don't follow a straight line. To ignore that call completely is to risk becoming like the princesses, not virtuous, but brittle, until one day the tapestry of the self snaps under a pressure it was never designed to withstand. The ideal is not the lonely loom or the frenzied mountain, but the city that learns to dance at the proper time, honoring the wild god so it may live in peace. 3 princesses began their story at the pinnacle of human order, their fingers weaving the very fabric of their society's values. They end it as creatures of shadow, fluttering through a darkness they refuse to acknowledge. Their journey is a tragic arc from absolute control to absolute loss, a descent mapped by the god they dared to deny. It is a story, at its heart, about the peril of hubris, that ancient Greek concept of overweening pride that places mortal judgment above divine law. But their hubris was a quiet, domestic kind. It was not a boast to a goddess like Niobe's, but a daily, silent verdict that their loom was holier than a mountain revel, that their disciplined hands were closer to truth than ecstatic hearts. For this, they faced the inescapable power of a force greater than any city wall. Dionysus proved that the wildness of nature and the chaos of the human psyche are not enemies to be defeated, but fundamental currents in reality itself. To build a life pretending those currents do not exist is to build on sand. The myth, in its brutal poetry, is an ancient search for balance. It does not tell us to abandon our looms and live forever in frenzy. It warns us that a world with only the loom, only order, control, and productivity becomes a prison that will eventually turn its keepers into monsters. The healthy city learned to schedule its madness, to give the wild god his festival so the rest of the year could remain sane. This is the enduring wisdom buried in the horror. So we are left with a final, reflective question, meant not for ancient Orchomenos, but for us. In our modern world, a world arguably more dedicated to productivity, optimization, and control than any the Minyas could have imagined, what are our Dionysian elements? What have we walled out in our pursuit of perfect order? Is it unstructured play, genuine communal celebration, unproductive creativity, or the simple, messy necessity of feeling our deepest emotions without immediately analyzing or fixing them? The call from the mountain is still there. It is the part of life that cannot be scheduled, measured, or woven into a tidy pattern. The myth of the Minyades asks us to listen before the threads of our own making begin to twist into vines, and the rhythm we've ignored becomes a drum we can no longer escape. What do you think we neglect today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into ancient psychology compelling, please like the video and subscribe for more journeys into the myths that still shape us.